Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pronago. Today we are going to be talking about Impending Doom, a StarCraft Brood War campaign made in 2016 and 2018, something like that. Released by DK, Damn You Fu himself. Now, DK's campaign was... I don't think it was really recommended to me by anybody. It was just that he had posted that he released it at... October of 2018. So I think he had taken it down from the initial release of 2016, and I'm sure if I'm historically inaccurate, DK will correct me in the comments. But I figured I would give it a try. It was one of the more recent productions that had been made in the quote-unquote modern era of Brood War content, and so I figured I would take a look at it. So the problem that immediately stands out before you even download the files, really, but I guess after you download the files you realize this, if it wasn't immediately fresh in your mind, is that there is no mod. And when you're not modding a Brood War custom campaign, your options for gameplay are incredibly limited, as we saw in a lot of the missions themselves, especially the ones that tried to do things that were very much... you would call them gimmicks in another campaign. I guess they were still sort of similar to gimmicks in this campaign. But the key distinction between those two things is that when you're dealing with a gimmick in another campaign, that gimmick might be a timed event that drains all your shields, or a hatchery that you hotkey. But these are meant to be like mainstays, mechanics that are in every one of the missions, or a vast majority of the missions, something that the player has to try to play around. It's just that their deployment, because of the lack of modding, means that it's not something a bit more reasonable, like shield damage being done by a structure that targets your units in a smaller area or something, which would be an ability you give that through modding. It's not, just clicking a button on a command card that you've modded in that allows the hero to fire off a particle beam, a Goku laser rifle, whatever, and that's where the damage comes from. Instead, it just spawns a bunch of projectiles on you, right? These are not... basically graciously implemented into the game. They are very much just, hey, I'm not modding, I'm not going to look into, custom ability code or anything like that. I'm just going to go straight in and completely ignore any sort of design tenet and just, put it in there, force it in there however it fits. And if it doesn't fit, then, oh well, I'm still going to try my best to put it in there. So just going to leave it, is what I feel, really what it came across as anyways. Now, DK himself did say on one of the streams that he tuned into that he didn't really feel like he was super dedicated to making this campaign. And I think it shows in the end product, because I feel like dedication to a craft, to making a high-quality product, that would show, some modding, some sort of changes to the formula of the games, and ways to try to work in those mechanics that he wanted to add into these missions, these micro sections, or even the macro sections, as we saw with the shield mechanic. He would have tried to work those in more natural ways that weren't using weird countdown timer triggers and stuff, that were more so geared towards something that the player could interact with, something that didn't require them to break their immersion entirely by using an RPG system for spells or something. Something that would have let them, the players that are, be able to essentially work within the confines of what the game allows them to work with, instead of using these sort of hackneyed workarounds to include these mechanics. I feel like that is the first thing that stands out, and that's why I brought up the lack of the mod right at the beginning of the review, because that is really where my expectations were kind of subverted. I was thinking, as a campaign released in 2018, campaign released relatively in a modern sense, of course it's going to have modding. Maybe it'll be 161, maybe it'll be StarCraft Remastered, whatever version of the game it's for, there should definitely be some modding. And, of course, unfortunately, there wasn't in this. So, now, I know that I've gone on the record many times claiming that, generally speaking, the micro missions and the like are just not useful. They're not, wise... not waste of time. They are waste of time is the problem. They're not wise ways to spend your time playing a game, right? They're not fulfilling. They don't engage you. And this is generally true for Impending Doom's micro missions as well. But I do think that it's actually a little puzzling. It's almost something you could say as praiseworthy that he included these weird hackneyed interpretations and deployments of these mechanics, like casting spells through a hatchery or, draining your shields away or whatever. It's, as long as you make those consistent, I guess that is something in your favor. But DK didn't even really do that. And it almost feels like he wasn't confident in that deployment, in that execution. And so he said, well, I've got to make some changes, but I'm only going to make these changes for this mission because they're the only mission to make sense for, which is stuff like introducing us to spawning in units on Agravac in, I think, the last Agravac mission, or one of them anyways, later on into the campaign, where that's a mechanic that we use for the rest of that mission, and it's one of the main things that we use for him. We use it more often than his heal, we use it more often than his AoE blast, and also changing things about those mechanics, like changing it so that the AoE blast doesn't affect structures or only affects certain classes of units, obviously not heroes and stuff. So, it doesn't lay out the rules of engagement immediately from the get-go as soon as you're introduced to the mechanic, which would be like the casting spells with the hatchery thing. There's not really any reason, it's common sense justification, story justification, for why something like warping in new units wouldn't be available to you in the first mission. And so realistically speaking, I think we should have seen Agravac at his full strength that makes sense for that point in the story. And that way, we're basically telling a story with those mechanics being available to the player. This is what Agravac, these are the tools like at his disposal. This is how powerful he is. And then if you want to add something in later on because he gets more powerful later on, or because more Tal'Darim show up to help him, or because of whatever, then you can do that. But you should be putting an effort into justifying why things are changing, why suddenly his blasts don't destroy buildings. Instead, we just get a tooltip expositioning us to the fact that this mechanic is now in the place, which completely destroys immersion, even more so than hockeying a hatchery in the first place, I would argue. Because it's telling you right then and there that the person who's making the story didn't care enough to tell you that through the story, to show you that through the story. Instead, they decided that they were just going to write a tooltip. It's sort of like in that Echoes mission, where there was a tooltip that popped up and said, hey, this mission crashes, and I didn't bother figuring out why. Be sure to save often. Like, obviously, it's a non-functional product, so I guess in that case, there's only a handful of missions in Impending Doom that were dysfunctional in an even remotely comparable sense. Obviously, it wasn't crashing at any point, so it's not really the same thing. But the fact that it shipped like that, and the fact that the way that he chooses to address that, in that case, Tippereth, who made Echoes, choosing to address it that way with just a tooltip, like, not only does it break immersion, but it's completely laughable. So in the case for DK, it was at least not crashing. The maps did have some really confusing triggers, and if you didn't know the way that the order of events that you were supposed to like hit, section A first, then B, then C. Like, I couldn't even identify A, B, and C, let alone, agree to hit them in that order. Maybe I want to go, maybe I want to rearrange my fucking alphabet, dude. You ever think of that? So it doesn't really feel like there's much consideration for introducing the player to the mechanics in the first place, then keeping the mechanics consistent across all maps, which would at the very least give us a little bit more to learn and improve upon our usage of these utilities that you are adding into the game. And it would set an expectation that, just like everything else in the base game of StarCraft, what I'm adding to the game is consistent with itself and will not change, and it's up to you to use that tool in different ways with combinations that vary depending on what other tools you have at your disposal in that mission to conquer the challenges that I am going to lay out in front of you. Instead, it was really just like, well, if I let you use a mechanic that you've been using in the first mission, in this mission, then it will be too OP. It'll be too broken. It will make it too trivial. And instead of making it so that the AI have some sort of answer to that, or that the challenge is somehow more than just dealing with structures by blowing them up with a spell, maybe making it so that your resources are more limited, or some sort of thing like that, where you could pull a balancing lever and make it so that it was still challenging. You really don't have any options like that. So again, basically, because he's not modding, he doesn't really have these options. And so as a result, he just disables their effectiveness on buildings all of a sudden. And then, of course, there were the innumerable invincible buildings just thrown out in the middle of nowhere with really no explanation. Especially the second shield drain mission. I forget what it was called, but it was the last Yarrow mission. That one really boiled my fucking balls, dude. I couldn't believe that they just had a random invincible supply depot in the cutscene area, and there was no explanation as to why. And I assume that that's just a bug, but I don't know. Maybe DK had some rationale behind it. Maybe he wanted them to continuously send defense units over there and piss you off. So I guess now we can get into the meat of the discussion about gameplay, because we talked about the new mechanics that DK has added. Well, how is he treating the old mechanics that are just, obviously intrinsic to StarCraft itself? He is basically working around them with a lot of the additions that he has, a lot of the gimmicks, you could call them, compared to basic StarCraft. But again, they are mostly consistent with at least they're always in there for the most part. I think there was, well, half of the RO missions had that shield drain thing. So that was definitely not consistent, I guess, because half of them didn't. But the shield drain thing is really, I think it bears special mention. An honorable fucking mention in this review because of how dumb it was and how much it completely removed engagement with an entire part of, like, an entire utility that you have as Protoss. It's just like, all right, well, now my race is fundamentally unbalanced. But I feel like even with that, it still wouldn't have been that much of an annoyance if the resources in these maps were not laid out in such a stupid fashion. And I don't just mean that the layouts, they were placed stupidly in a way that it is deliberately annoying to mine resources from. In many missions, you don't even get a choice as to where you're going to warp in your structures. They get warped in for you in a weird kind of cutscene. And because I think the motivation behind this makes sense, because DK wants you to not have to wait for a Nexus to finish before you keep playing. But you can address this by giving them something to do while they're warping in a Nexus, or, in my opinion, a much better solution, just having them start out with the Nexus. And, I guess I'll get to, like, the individual characters having completely different kinds of gameplay styles later on, because I think that can work in a vacuum, but it just didn't end up working out here, really. I'll get into that a little bit later on if I remember. But when it comes to the shield regen missions, right? You have these resources that are just, they're very sparse. I'll put it that way. Usually you just have one, maybe two mineral fields, like resource fields or expansions, whatever you want to call them, resource areas that you can harvest from. And I'm okay with the resources being low, but the AI should not be playing by, like, completely different rules, basically not having any of these restrictions. Obviously, you should be modding your AI in an RTS, especially if it's an RTS mission, like a lot of these are trying to be, at least, if not actually being. And, you have a situation where you want to be able to say, I beat that AI fair and square, or I lost to that AI fair and square, not the alternative, which is what this campaign was, where it was like I grinded through this slog of an experience, or I made these, like, pixel perfect moves with my micro and my macro, and I played it exactly the way the designer wanted me to play it, because that's the only way to win. Now, it may very well be that a superior player could clear these relatively easily in ways that DK has not even envisioned. But usually, when it comes to the average skill level, which I don't believe I'm so far beyond, although I have seen people who claim to be average who I can't help but cry at, but I am not good at the game, and I was still able to clear most of these missions, but the RTS missions in particular were more annoying just because of the fact that they had all of these extra things laid on top of them, like the AI working off of completely different rule sets, not needing any money, barely even building workers for that matter, so they of course had more supply to fill up with units. Stuff that the player doesn't have the option to do. They don't have the luxury of having infinite money. They don't have the luxury of thus not needing any workers because they don't need to mine resources. So obviously if the rules were even, the AI would be, a cakewalk. Whereas if, the only way to make a challenge with unmodded AI is to, I guess you could, like, layer a bunch of scripts on top of each other or whatever, but outside of doing that, which is very gimmicky and or hit or miss, I guess is the best way to put it. It's hit or miss at best. You're really just in a sorry state, man. Working with that, it's not going to work out without modding. You're basically stuck doing stuff like this, where you're making all of these exceptions to the rules for the AI, giving them all this money, making it so that they start out with the entire map and under their control. I've talked about this a lot in the Legends of Arcane reviews, but in case people have missed it, and it does bear repeating, when you're starting out a mission and the AI has the entire map under their control or a significant portion of it, the story that is then told by me walking in and building a base and harvesting from, like, 5 mineral patches worth of resources or whatever, the story told by me winning in that case basically means that this enemy is completely fucking incompetent, especially when they have enough pre-placed shit to A-move me 1,000 times over, because I start out with way less stuff than they do. So you really don't want to tell that kind of story with your gameplay. You want to make it so that your enemies are competent, because then it adds value to actually defeating them. It adds impact. Not only does the story not, the immersion in the story not break, the player will look at the triumphs that this character that they have been following has had. In this case, like Yarrow, we can take a look at this Protoss guy, Yarrow. Well, I respect his achievements if he's actually fought enemies, but he hasn't. He's just fought like weird mannequins that receive instructions and follow them, and otherwise are playing a completely different game than Yarrow is. And on top of it, on a more personal level, the players themselves will feel more immersed and more engrossed in the experience of playing your game, because they're being engaged with, and because in order to win, they actually had to exert some skill. They had to express their skill at a high enough level to pass the skill check, right, of the mission and claim victory. And as a result of that, you have a lot of more positive interactions with the end product than this one was, where I felt like I was having my time wasted because that was a supplement for challenge where there actually wasn't any. So it leads back to the mod issue, right? Just like the consistency in mechanics leads back to the mod issue. If the mechanics aren't actually introduced or implemented rather in a consistent manner, then of course they're going to be inconsistent, and of course there's going to be a lot of problems with them. Just based on the player's experience with them, they are going to be very different from map to map, or at the very least somewhat different from map to map in a meaningful way, like not being able to destroy buildings all of a sudden when that was actually the only way you could progress in some of these missions. Stuff like that is very obvious. I think that you really have to be consistent with that, and that leads back to modding, because you need to be modding in order to achieve that consistency in Brood War, in the environment of Brood War. That might not be true for other RTS, but it is true for Brood War. And so you have that as your first pivotal point. And then you have the challenge not coming from actually engaging with an opponent on relatively even playing fields, where them winning is an act of skill on the AI's part, and you winning is an act of skill on your part. When you don't have that, then the engagement is no longer engaging. And as a result, it becomes a lot harder to really take the project seriously, and again, to feel like your time isn't being wasted. And, I've really been harping on that a lot lately, because I've been playing a lot of projects that I feel like am having my time wasted playing. And maybe, I can still look back and say, well, it was educational, or it was entertaining, or whatever. And, hopefully people get something out of it that they enjoy, be it an educational slant or an entertaining quip that I say. And there is some value in that, of course. I'm not denying that. But the act of playing by itself, like, I wouldn't play any of these campaigns that I've played in the past, year or so. I don't think, without the record button being pushed. And because that's because I'm adding value to the experience by trying to be educational and trying to be entertaining. And I hope that I've achieved that in all of my productions, obviously. But I think it goes to show that it really is important to engage the player, and again, through consistent mechanics and not random shit, because that's not really engaging the player. It's not really going to be able to follow what they're supposed to be doing. And I guess the best way to put it is to reference the first Dark Templar mission that we played. I think the guy's name is Elzar. So Elzar is a Dark Templar, and in that mission, if you don't follow the exact steps of, there's really not very much room for error, but there's also no tutorializing. And so in order to win this mission, you basically have to scout out the position of a bunch of Terrazine canisters, grab them with probes, some of which require a shuttle to access, in a fairly low econ map. And you also are on a time limit because, of course, there's Zerg Campaign Insane running. And there's no way to, even if you go to the area where you ultimately have to bring the Terrazine, that there's not even any puzzly hints, like some modded tiles that indicate that Terrazine is there, or Terrazine being there in more than just one of them. There's two of them, or there is one of them, but it's resting on some sort of beacon-like doodad, which is even in the game to begin with. You don't even need to mod that in. Something that would give you some sort of contextual clue, like, hey, there's 5 Terrazine on this map that I've found. And hey, there's 6 beacons and one of them has a Terrazine on it. I wonder what's going on there. I mean, hell, even the presence of 5 individual beacons, if there were actually 5 Terrazine, I don't remember how many there were. It's 5 or 6, something like that. Even if they didn't have any Terrazine on it, that would still indicate oh wait, there's 5 of them. They're in a sort of weird pattern, so obviously they're noticeable. They stand out amongst everything else in the map. That is subtle, tutorializing, subtle visual storytelling that allows the player to feel like, oh, there was a way for me to figure out this weird puzzle thing at the end of the map, it doesn't just come out of left field. Right now, it very much comes out of left field. DK had to warn me well before the map actually ended. It also is not consistent with previous Terrazine harvesting mechanics where you would just bring a unit or a hero to the Terrazine and then it would just disappear because it would get recalled. So there's no way that I could have possibly known that I had to collect it with a probe instead of collecting it like I had in the past with the Agravac guy. So, of course, that's also some other inconsistent elements. You can basically point to anything in DK's campaign, and you can find stuff like this, where things are just inconsistent. They're sort of similar to an old thing, which makes it even more confusing when the way that you're interacting with it is completely different than the way you interacted with that other thing in the past, in this case, Terrazine. And that leads to really frustrating engagements where it's almost like the map expects you to know how to solve it without actually, tutorializing that at any point. And it pulls the rug out from under you and it says, now it suddenly spells out exactly how you solve it, but you have like 3 fucking minutes to solve it, and there's no way to do that when you're on an insane time limit of a bunch of spawned Zerg that you can't fight back against. So really the only way to actually win is to somehow know in the future, like look into the future and say, hey, I'm a first timer playing this map. I've never seen it before, I've never played it before, but I'm going to litter the whole map with photon cannons and or find all of these Terrazine and collect them with probes, neither of which is something that you've had to do in any of the previous missions. So the solutions to the map, in order to actually win, are not provided to you. They're not tutorialized to you, they're not hinted at. And the only time they're spelled out explicitly, which is generally not how you want to do your tutorializing and your information control anyways, it's the same thing as exposition for your story. You don't want to exposition the solution to your gameplay loop or puzzle or whatever it happens to be. By the time that you get that deliberate, complete, literal explanation of exactly what you have to do, and the game literally tells you how to play it, it's already too late to win if you haven't already done those instructions. And so it seems like such an obvious thing to me that I think DK really knew automatically, like, oh yeah, I know that this mission is fucked. I know that there's a lot of problems with it. But he also, I think, knew a lot of the stuff that I was going to say anyways about this campaign. And so maybe that was part of the frustration that was setting in, is that I'm dealing with stuff that to me is so obviously wrong, and that I feel like the creator has some understanding of why it's wrong and what specifically is wrong, and maybe even how to resolve it, but just didn't. And that's something that is more frustrating to me than somebody who doesn't know any better. If you do know better and you just don't do it, then it's kind of lazy and annoying to know that information and then play it, right? If you played a released product or whatever, another custom campaign, and that was happening to you, you were dealing with something that was really frustrating, but you in the back of your head knew that the person who made this knew that it was frustrating, knew that it was subpar, and didn't do anything about it. That would add to the frustration, I think. It's not like I feel personally insulted, obviously. I'm just saying I would personally feel, or I did personally feel here, that more could have been done, and that more so the creator knew that more could have been done and just decided not to. So, obviously, if I know that DK has like a job and he's got other obligations, and at that point you just take more time to work on it until it's done, right? That would be my thought process. When I'm working on stuff and I know it's going to take 6 months, a year, whatever to finish, I don't say, well, I'm just going to cut all the corners and just not fix stuff. Or if I guess maybe even more realistically, if I think I'm on track to a release or something that I've not publicly announced but privately discussed, and say like, yeah, I should be able to finish this in 6 months. And then 5 months later, I find a bunch of issues that I know is going to take longer than a month to resolve while still finishing the rest of the project. I don't then still release it without those flaws corrected. And it feels even more confusing since I think, like I said at the beginning of the review, DK actually did release this in 2016, then took it down and re-released it in 2018. So I'm really not sure what's up with that. But nonetheless, that was Impending Doom. I definitely feel like the core issues that it struggled with, and I didn't really talk about the story because it's not something that particularly interests me, but I think the core issue is really that they transcended any story element. It was just that the gimmicks were not, or the different mechanics to the missions that were added in through triggers, they were not properly tutorialized most of the time, and they also were not consistent across all maps, which made them super confusing. The twists to certain missions or puzzles to certain missions the information control on them was very poor, to the point where either it would tell you too much or nothing at all, and still expected you to, execute it well. I'm fine with having a challenge, but give me the tools to work with, and then I can show you whether or not I'm fit to solve that challenge, whether or not I'm actually a good player. I never really felt like I could express my skill outside of like a couple of small instances. I didn't really touch on the boss battles. They were a disaster, but hopefully the footage of me playing them was enough to explain why. And obviously anytime you're actually dealing with RTS-esque missions, like the Yarrow missions and some of the Elzar ones, it was just either gimmick central, where stuff was just different for no reason, like your entire base goes up in flames in one of those temple maps for seemingly no reason because some Void Archon Amon guy decided to kill you. And then we had 2 boss battles back to back. That was insane. Or you had a lot of situations where, like in the Yarrow missions, the AI just starts out with the entire map at their disposal, under their control, and they're just able to deal with that. They're just able to lose somehow, even though they have all that stuff. So it becomes unbelievable, immersion breaking, and also frustrating because the only way to do it is to slog through really slowly. Or if I guess you know the exact solution beforehand because you've played it or you are the creator, then you can win it just fine. And at that point, there is still not really any challenge. The challenge is like, having enough patience to find that perfect solution. And that's not really super interesting to me anyways, so that automatically makes it really difficult to have patience with that. So, I mean, there's certainly some positive things about Impending Doom. I thought that, like I said, it was really interesting to have the individual characters have their different mechanics, but they needed to be more consistent. That's really like the point that I wanted to hit on, is that if you want Elzar to be more tactical, to have some build and destroy, but be less full frontal than Yarrow, then that's okay. That's like an interesting approach. How would you do that lower scale or smaller scale, but still intense game design? Well, you certainly wouldn't do it with the random twists and your base being blown up and dealing with fucking boss battles after an RTS mission, and it just doesn't make any sense. And Yarrow even had some of that syndrome in him with the I think the second Yarrow mission when we were clearing out they had those invincible structures in the bottom right hand corner, and then we had to bring Yarrow to the top left corner, and then we had to bring him to the top or bottom left corner. It's just stupid. It's like, I don't get it. So it felt like there was like too much trying to happen at the same time in the same mission. So Yarrow had some of that stuff later on, the same as Elzar, but Yarrow is meant to be more full frontal, and yet half of his fucking tech is gone after the first mission for no reason. And then the first Agravac is obviously more micro-oriented, and there's like a weird fucking semi-bound, I guess there's like a set of boss battles or stuff. I unfortunately didn't get that stuff on camera because I was too pissed off. But that was definitely a situation where the mechanics were not elegantly implemented into the game. When you just have fucking Dark Archons named Fire Orb instead of actually having explosions that deal damage, that you can modding in some turrets or something that actually attack your units and engage with you the same way that units normally do. Or if you're going to add some new way to engage with enemies or for enemies to engage with you, then do it through modding instead of these weird trigger systems where all you can do is set my HP to 1% or blow me up like flame knives. It's really just not a good idea in that respect. So again, all of these individual ideas might work if you put in the work to make them properly implemented in the game through modding. But they're not going to work with triggers, and they're really going to just seem out of fucking place and just strange. That's not to say really anything about a lot of the bugs that we found that hopefully do get fixed, because you don't really have to add to the frustration by having a bunch of bugs. It seemed like hyper triggers were missing or something was going on in a lot of those, but yeah. Another thing you could remove with modding, you can just set the game to work with as if it had single frame hypers active with a memory patch, which is something that I'm doing in all my projects now. So that's definitely another thing you can mess around with. As for the future for Impending Doom and for DK in general, I hope this isn't his last campaign. I hope that if he does want to go with his micro missions or his non-standard gameplay, he's able to flesh it out more so that it is more satisfying and more complete. And otherwise, if he wants to continue making RTS missions, and in addition to or instead of entirely replacing the other stuff for future projects, I'd be happy to continue to talk about those. I'm probably going to anyways, macro-oriented concepts and level design stuff. And generally speaking, I feel like there was potential with Impending Doom. Hopefully he can fully realize it in a future project, whether or not he sticks with the non-standard new mechanic stuff Hopefully he just ends up adding it through modding. So that's what I'm hoping. I hope it was useful for you, DK. Hope it was enjoyable and entertaining and educational for everybody else as well. And I will see you guys in the next custom campaign playthrough, whatever it happens to be. Big kisses.